The bridge gave way beneath the wagon wheels with a crack like a rifle shot, and Nora Doyle felt the whole world tip sideways into empty air. She had time only to grab the edge of the seat before the front axle dropped through splintered planks, the horses screaming and rearing against their traces, the ravine yawning 50 feet below where Larkspur Creek ran white over rocks. The survey case with its precious maps slid past her boot. She lunged for it without thinking, which was the wrong thing to do, because the motion threw her clear of the seat just as the wagon bed folded downward and pitched her toward the gap in the broken timbers. She did not fall far. A hand closed around her wrist like a manacle, and then an arm banded around her waist, and she was hauled backward against a chest built like a stone wall, boot heels dug hard into what remained of solid decking. For one suspended moment she hung there, half over the drop, the creek roaring beneath her skirts, and then she was pulled bodily onto the bank as the rest of the bridge tore free, and the wagon crashed down into the water with a sound like the end of the world. The horses had broken loose in time, thank God, and stood trembling on the far side, but the wagon itself was matchwood. "You are all right," the man said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low and rough, like gravel dragged over granite, and it came from somewhere above her because she had ended up sitting hard against his boots, her heart slamming so violently she could feel it in her teeth. Nora looked up, and up further, at the largest man she had ever seen outside of a circus poster. He was not fat. He was built the way old oak trees were built, wide through the shoulders and thick through the forearms where his rolled sleeves showed skin brown dark by 20 summers of trail dust. His hair was too long for town fashion, near to his collar, streaked here and there with premature silver, though his face did not look much past 35, and a short beard shadowed a jaw that looked as though it had been carved rather than grown. His eyes were pale gray, startling against the sun-darkened skin, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how her hair had come loose from its pins. "I believe," Nora said once she had located her voice, "that I have just lost the survey wagon." "You have," the man agreed. Crouched, which brought his face nearer to hers, and something in her chest did a strange, unfamiliar thing at the proximity of him, some animal awareness of size and warmth and strength held very carefully in check. "You near lost considerably more than that." "I am aware." She let him help her to her feet and found her knees less reliable than she would have liked. "Thank you, truly. I would be obliged if you would tell me your name so that I know whose account to settle for the trouble." "Warren Hunter." He said it the way a man says a thing he expects to cause a reaction, watching her face for it. It did cause one, though perhaps not the one he expected. Nora had heard the name spoken at the trading post with a particular hush, the way men spoke of grizzly country or bad water. Warren Hunter, they said, who had run wagon trains from the Missouri clear to the Bitterroot for 15 years and left men behind on the trail when the weather turned, who had a temper like a struck match, and a silence that unsettled grown men twice his age. She had pictured someone leaner and meaner, with cruelty sitting in his face like a permanent guest. This man's eyes, up close, held nothing of the sort. They held worry and something wary, as though he expected her to flinch from him now that the name was spoken. "You caught me before I went into the creek," Nora said carefully. "That is the only account of you I have any use for at present, Mr. Hunter." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick as a fish turning in shallow water. "Most folks around here have heard other accounts first." "I imagine they have." She bent to retrieve the survey case, which had landed mercifully on the bank rather than in the water, and checked the buckles with hands that still trembled slightly. "I generally prefer to judge a man by what is directly in front of me. At present what is in front of me is a man who kept me from drowning. The rest can wait." He studied her for a long moment, as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue he was trying to translate, and then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, the memory of a man who did not smile, often finding that his face still remembered the shape of it. "That bridge has been rotten 2 years," he said. Ezra Whitfield's been meaning to see it fixed since the spring flood took the center piling. I will see it done before the week's out, so nobody else goes into the creek behind you. You do trading post business as well as trail work. I do most everything these days. He looked toward the wreck of the wagon, then back at her. You are the surveyor's girl, Doyle's daughter, Nora Doyle. She held out her hand, man fashion, because it seemed the honest thing to do after he had just hauled her back from the edge of a ravine by main strength. He took it as though he were not entirely certain it would not break, his palm rough with old rope burn and dry as saddle leather, and let go before propriety required it. My father taught me to read land better than most men read newspapers. The railroad hired me to carry chain and keep the field book when their own assistant took a fever in July. It pays better than trapping, some months. Some months, Warren repeated, and something in his tone told her he knew exactly how thin those months could run, up here where a hard winter could mean the difference between a family eating and a family starving. They walked the horses the long way around, following the creek bank down to the ford, and by the time they came into sight of Larkspur crossing, the sun was dropping gold over the western ridges and half the town, it seemed, had already heard about the bridge. Larkspur Crossing was not much of a town by the standards of places further east. A scattering of log buildings and false-fronted stores clustered where two mountain roads met at a ford, with a trading post at its center that served everyone from the ranch families in the lower valley to the trappers and loggers scattered through the high country beyond. In autumn it swelled with traffic, cattle being driven down from summer range, wagons loaded with the last of the harvest, men come in to trade furs and buy provisions against the winter to come. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys into a sky already going the deep, clean blue of a mountain evening. Ezra Whitfield himself came out onto the porch of the trading post, a stout, balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and threw up his hands at the sight of the empty wagon bed and the missing wagon and tire. Lord above, Nora Doyle, what happened to you? The Larkspur Bridge happened, she said, and Mr. Hunter happened to be standing close enough to catch me when it did. Whitfield's gaze went to Warren, and something passed over his face, wariness quickly smoothed away by manners. Well, that was providential of him. It was, Nora agreed, and did not miss the way several of the men loitering near the porch had gone quiet and still at Warren Hunter's approach, the way conversation resumed only once he had walked past them toward the corral to see to the horses. She filed the observation away, the way she filed away deer tracks and weather signs, a piece of information she did not yet fully understand but suspected she would need later. Her father was waiting inside, seated near the stove with his bad leg propped on a barrel, the old injury from a bear trap some 6 winters back that had never fully healed and grew worse with every cold season. Silas Doyle had been the finest trapper in 3 counties in his day, and though age and injury had slowed him, his eyes were as sharp as ever, and they went first to her face, checking for harm before he even asked what had happened. "I'm unhurt, Papa," she said before he could ask. "The bridge is gone and the wagon with it, but I have the survey case, and that is the important thing." "You are the important thing," Silas said, in the tone of a man who had said this before and expected to have to say it again. "Maps can be redrawn." "Not these maps," Nora said, quieter, and did not elaborate further, because something about the discrepancies she had begun noticing in the survey figures over the past 2 weeks was not yet a thing she understood well enough to speak of aloud, even to her father. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the room she and her father kept above Whitfield's store, Nora found her thoughts returning not to the maps, not even to the horror of the falling bridge, but to the particular gray of a stranger's eyes, and the strange gentleness with which such an enormous man had set her down on solid ground. She did not see Warren Hunter again for 4 days, and in that time the trading post grew crowded with the business of harvest, wagons rolling in loaded with wheat and dried corn, cattle bawling in the pens as drovers pushed a small herd through on their way to the railhead further south. the whole valley smelling of dust and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of hay cut and stacked against winter. Nora spent her days at the survey table Whitfield had given over to her use in the back corner of the store, transcribing chain measurements into the field book. And it was there, on the fourth evening, bent over a column of figures by lamplight, that she first noticed the thing that would nearly get her killed. The provisioning manifest for the winter contract, the one that listed how many wagon loads of flour and salt pork and coal oil were to be freighted up to the remote outposts along Kestrel Pass before the snow closed the road, did not match the survey notes for the route at all. The manifest claimed the upper switchback beyond Miller's camp was impassable to heavy wagons this season, citing a rockslide that Nora's own chain measurements, taken not 3 weeks before, showed no evidence of whatsoever. She had walked that very switchback herself. There had been no rockslide. Which meant that someone, somewhere between the survey office and the contractor's desk, had altered the report, and the outposts along the upper pass, families she had grown up trading with, the Petersons and the Callahans and old widow Ruiz with her 6 grandchildren, were about to be told that no supply wagons could reach them before spring. She sat very still for a long moment, the lamp flickering, and thought about who stood to profit from provisions paid for but never delivered. She did not yet have the answer, but she knew, with the same instinct that had kept her alive on 100 solitary treks through grisly country, that she needed to be careful who she asked. It was 2 evenings later that her father's trapline nearly cost her everything. Silas could no longer manage the full circuit himself, not with his leg as it was, and so it had fallen to Nora, as it had for 2 winters now, to run the line that stretched along the timbered slopes above Larkspur Creek, checking traps for marten and fox before the pelts spoiled or some other creature made off with the catch. She knew that trapline the way she knew the sound of her own name, had walked it since she was 12 years old at her father's side, learning to read the set of a trap, and the drag of a chain, and the particular hush of the forest when something dangerous moved through it. She should have turned back an hour before dusk. She knew that later with the clarity that always comes too late, but the 4th trap had been sprung and dragged, and she had followed the drag mark another quarter-mile hoping to recover the pelt before some other predator claimed it, and by the time she gave up the chase, the light was already dying fast behind the western ridge, the way it did in the mountains in early autumn, gold to gray to a deep bruised blue in the space of 20 minutes. She was not afraid at first. She knew this country. But the fog that rose off the creek that evening was thicker than any she had seen in years, curling up through the pines in pale ribbons, until the familiar shapes of rock and deadfall blurred into a landscape she no longer recognized. She turned, meaning to retrace her own tracks back toward the main trail, and found the ground already frosted enough that her earlier prints had faded to shadows indistinguishable from the natural texture of the forest floor. An hour later, with full dark come down and no moon yet risen above the ridge, Nora Doyle understood, with a cold clarity that settled into her stomach like a swallowed stone, that she was lost on her own trapline. It was, she would think later, the particular horror of it that stayed with her longest, not the darkness itself which she had weathered before, but the terrible intimacy of being lost in a place she knew so well. She recognized this rock outcropping. She had passed it twice now, she was almost certain, though the fog made every shape uncertain, every shadow suspect. She found trap set number 6, the one she had checked and reset not 2 hours before, and understood with sick certainty that she had walked in a wide circle and come back to where she started. She made herself stop. Panic, her father had taught her, kills faster than cold or hunger or any beast in the woods. She built a small fire with hands that shook only a little, using the dry tinder she always carried, and settled with her back against a boulder to wait out the worst of the fog, telling herself that, with clear sky and stars, she would find her bearings again. The stars did not come. The fog thickened instead, and the temperature dropped with the particular viciousness of high mountain autumn nights, and somewhere in the dark timber above her a wolf, or something that wanted her to think it was a wolf, called once, long and low, and was answered. She had her rifle. She had her knife. She was not helpless, and she reminded herself of that fact with every shallow breath. But she was also, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely uncertain of the way home. It was the sound of a horse's hoof striking stone that reached her first, carried strange and distorted through the fog, and Nora came up off the boulder with her rifle raised before some deeper instinct, some registering of the particular unhurried rhythm of the approach, made her lower it a fraction. Nora Doyle. The voice came before the shape did, low and carrying, pitched to reach her without alarming whatever might be listening in the dark alongside her. If that is you sitting afire in the middle of your own trapline, I would take it kindly if you would answer, because I have been riding this slope for the better part of 2 hours and my nerves are not what they once were. Mr. Hunter. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, cracked with a relief so sudden it nearly buckled her knees. The same. And then he was there, materializing out of the fog on a big roan horse, leading a second animal behind him, his silhouette enormous and solid, and more welcome than anything Nora had seen in her entire life. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped and crossed to her in 3 strides, and for one unguarded moment his hand came up as though he meant to take hold of her shoulders and satisfy himself she was whole, before he seemed to catch himself and let it fall. "You are unhurt," he said instead, his eyes moving over her with a thoroughness that made her feel absurdly less like a woman being assessed for injury and more like something precious being accounted for. "Unhurt, only turned around. The fog came in faster than I judged, and I lost my bearings following a dragged trap." She hated how her voice shook on the confession, she who prided herself on never getting lost, but Warren only nodded, unsurprised, as though fog thick enough to steal a trapper's daughter's sense of direction was simply a fact of the mountains he had long ago made his peace with. "Whitfield sent word your father was fretting when you did not come in by dark," he said. "I know this slope near as well as you do. Better maybe in the fog, since I have run pack trains through worse on nights I would rather not remember. How did you find me? You built your fire at the base of Miller's outcropping." He nodded toward the rock at her back. "I have passed that stone 1,000 times. Knew if you had any sense left in you, and I judged you for a woman with plenty, you would hold your position rather than blunder around further and lose yourself worse. Only had to work my way along the ridge until I saw the glow through the fog." "I very nearly did blunder around further," Nora admitted. "It was pride kept me still more than sense. Pride will serve out here, so long as it points the right direction." He held out his hand, and this time she took it without hesitation, let him help her up onto the second horse he had brought, a placid gray mare that seemed entirely unbothered by fog or dark or wolves calling somewhere in the timber. "Stay close behind me. I know this ground, but I would rather not test the fog's opinion of my memory more than I must." They rode in silence for a time, Warren leading, his big shoulders a solid dark shape ahead of her in the gloom, and Nora found herself watching the easy, unhurried competence of him, the way he read the ground beneath the horse's feet by some sense she could not name, adjusting course a fraction here and there with no visible landmark to guide him. "You are not what they say of you," she said finally, into the quiet. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had gone lower, rougher, a man picking his way over old and painful ground the way he had been picking his way over the fog-bound slope. "What do they say of me? That you left men to die on the trail, that you have no more feeling in you than a stone, that a woman would be a fool to trust you within arm's reach. And what do you say?" "I say a man does not ride 2 hours through fog thick enough to lose a woman on her own trapline, unless he has more feeling in him than most men show in a lifetime." The silence that followed was different from the one before, weighted with something neither of them named. When he finally spoke again, it was quieter still. "There was a train I guided, 11 years back, caught by early snow and the wind rivers. I made a call to leave 3 wagons that could not keep pace, so the rest might reach shelter before the storm closed the pass entire. The families in those 3 wagons survived. Trappers found them 2 days later, half frozen but living, because I left them provisions and a fire and pushed on with the rest, so none of us froze waiting on wagons that could not move faster than they moved. But the story that traveled faster than the truth was that Warren Hunter abandoned families to die in the snow. It has followed me every mile since, growing teeth it never had, until men flinch from me in trading posts I have never set foot in before. Nora absorbed this in silence, watching his back, the set of his shoulders that had not changed through the telling, a man long accustomed to carrying a burden he had given up trying to set down. "That is not the same story as the one they tell," she said. "No," he agreed. "It rarely is. I believe your account of it." "Why?" "Because you rode 2 hours through fog to find a trapper's daughter you had known 4 days, and asked nothing of me in return, but that I hold still and trust you knew the ground." She let that settle a moment before adding, with the ghost of a smile he could not see but perhaps heard in her voice, "A man who abandons wagons in a storm does not do that." He said nothing more, but something in the line of his shoulders eased, and they rode the rest of the way down out of the fog and into the lamplit yard of the trading post in a silence that felt, for the first time in either of their lives in some while, like company rather than solitude. Silas Doyle was waiting on the porch with a lantern, and the relief that broke over his face at the sight of his daughter, whole and upright on the gray mare, was answer enough to any question Nora might have asked about how frightened he had been. "You'll not run that line alone again till this fog season passes," her father said, gripping her hand as Warren helped her down. "Not without someone riding the ridge road behind you at a distance, and I don't care how many years you've walked that ground." "I did not intend to get lost, Papa." "No one intends it. That's precisely the trouble with getting lost." He looked past her to Warren, and something passed between the 2 men, an old trail hand's unspoken understanding. "I am obliged to you, Hunter, more than I can rightly say." "No obligation," Warren said. "Any man worth the name would have done the same, finding a light on a night like this." "Not every man would have known where to look," Silas said, and that more than anything seemed to settle something between them, because Warren merely nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and led both horses toward the corral without further comment, though Nora noticed he looked back once before the darkness took him. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had precisely planned, but both found themselves settling into with an ease that surprised them. Warren took to appearing at the trading post most mornings on some errand or another, mending the corral fence, hauling freight for Whitfield, and more often than not he found reason to linger near the corner where Nora kept her survey table, watching her work with an attention that had nothing lazy in it. "You read that country better than the railroad men who drew the original charts," he observed one morning, looking over her shoulder at a sketch of the upper pass she was refining from her own chain notes. "Most surveyors I have guided could not tell a game trail from a wagon road without a compass in each hand. My father taught me before I could properly write my letters," Nora said. "He used to say a person who could not read land had no business claiming to know a place, no matter how many maps they owned. Your father is a wise man. He is a stubborn man, which in these mountains often amounts to the same thing." She glanced up at him and found him watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something warm and slightly bewildered, as though he could not quite account for how he had come to be standing in a trading post, enjoying the company of a woman with ink on her fingers and mud on her boots. "You are frowning at those figures," he said. "Same as you were 3 days back before the fog took you." She hesitated. She had told no one the full extent of what she had found in the manifests, uncertain still who might be trusted with it, but something in his steady gray eyes, something in the memory of 2 hours spent riding fog-bound slopes to find her, decided the matter. "The winter provisioning contract for the outposts along Kestrel Pass," she said, low, though the store was mostly empty at that hour. "The manifest claims the upper switchback is impassable due to a rockslide. I surveyed that switchback 3 weeks ago. There is no rockslide, Mr. Hunter. The road is clear as it has ever been." Warren went very still, the ease gone out of his posture in an instant, replaced by something harder, more alert. "Who holds that provisioning contract?" "Elias Kane. He supplies most every outpost between here and the railhead." "I haul freight for Kane," Warren said slowly, and Nora saw the understanding move through him, the pieces settling into a shape neither of them liked. 2 loads a month all summer. Flour, salt pork, coal, oil, same as the manifest lists. If the pass is truly clear, then someone is telling those families they'll get no winter provisions and pocketing the difference on goods already paid for by the railroad company. That is precisely what I fear. Nora closed the field book, suddenly conscious of how exposed the survey table felt, tucked in the corner though it was. The Petersons, the Callahans, old widow Ruiz and her grandchildren, they will spend the winter in territory that gets 40 feet of snow some seasons, believing no help is coming, when in truth the help was paid for and simply never sent. "That would kill people," Warren said flatly. "Slow maybe, but it would kill people come January. I know it. Does Kane know you have seen the discrepancy?" "I have told no one but you and my father. And I told my father only that the figures troubled me, not the whole of what I suspected." "Keep it that way a while longer," Warren said, and there was something in his voice now, a wagon master's old instinct for danger on the trail ahead, that made the hair rise on her arms. "Kane is not a man who tolerates loose ends kindly. I have hauled for him 3 seasons and never once trusted the warmth of his handshake. It was, in the end, only 2 days before the loose end found them regardless." Nora had gone alone to the survey office Kane kept at the edge of Larkspur Crossing, a modest clapboard building where the railroad company's papers were filed and countersigned before being sent on to the territorial office, meaning to compare her own field notes against the official manifest one final time before deciding how best to raise the alarm. She had not expected to find Elias Kane himself there, a lean, well-dressed man with a salesman's easy smile that never quite reached his eyes, going through the very ledger she had come to examine. "Miss Doyle." His smile widened when he saw her, though something behind it sharpened. "I did not expect the pleasure of your company this afternoon. I came to check a figure in the switchback survey," she said, keeping her voice light though her pulse had begun to hammer. "I believe there may have been a transcription error." "Is that so?" Kane closed the ledger with deliberate slowness. "You are a careful young woman, Miss Doyle. Your father trained you well, but I would caution you against troubling yourself over figures that are, I assure you, entirely correct. Mountain surveys shift season to season. Rockslides come and go. It would not do for an assistant, however capable, to make claims about official contracts she does not fully understand." "I understand chain measurements well enough, Mr. Kane. I walked that switchback myself in early September. There was no slide." The smile did not move, but something behind Kane's eyes went cold and flat as a snake's. "Perhaps your memory of the terrain is mistaken. Fatigue can play strange tricks on a person's certainty. I would hate to see a promising young woman's reputation for accuracy called into question over a matter of fatigue." It was not quite a threat. It did not need to be, spoken in that particular tone, with that particular stillness behind the eyes. Nora left the office with the ledger unexamined in her hands, once outside, shaking with a fury she had not expected to feel so strongly. She told Warren everything that evening in the lengthening shadows behind the trading post corral and watched his jaw tighten with every word until it stood out like carved stone. "He threatened you." He did not say the words outright. He did not need to. "I will not have it," Warren said, low and rough. And for a moment Nora saw something in him that the rumors had gotten right after all, a temper banked deep but real, capable of violence if the right target presented itself. "I will go to him myself, Tell him plain that if one hair on your head is troubled, you will do nothing of the kind. Nora put a hand flat against his chest, more to steady herself than to stop him, though it worked for both purposes, and felt the thunder of his heart beneath her palm, felt him go still at the touch. If you go to him in anger, he will only grow more careful, and we will lose whatever chance we have of proving what he has done before winter closes the pass. I need evidence, not a fight. I cannot simply stand by while he threatens you. You are not standing by. You are standing beside me, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more useful. She held his gaze steady, though her hand still rested against him, and neither of them seemed inclined to remove it. I need the freight manifest you have signed for Kane these past 3 months. If his own bills of lading do not match the volume claimed delivered against what was actually paid for by the railroad company, that is evidence no clever ledger trick can explain away. Something in his face shifted, the anger banking down into something steadier, more purposeful, and he covered her hand with his own briefly before stepping back. I have every manifest I have ever signed for the man, he said. 15 years hauling freight, I never once threw away a bill of lading. Come to my place tomorrow evening. We will go through them together. Warren Hunter's cabin sat a mile above the trading post on a shoulder of land overlooking the whole valley, a solid 2-room structure of squared logs he had built himself over the past 3 years, since he had finally set down the reins of wagon mastering for good. Nora had expected, given his reputation, something rough and comfortless, and found instead a home of careful, quiet order. A good stone hearth, shelves built true and square, a small collection of books that surprised her until she remembered that a man who guided families across 2,000 miles of wilderness might well have had ample cause to learn geography and law and medicine along the way. They spent the evening at his table with a lamp burning low and a stack of manifests between them, Nora's quick eyes moving down column after column while Warren read the figures aloud. And it was, despite the grim purpose of it, one of the most companionable evenings Nora could remember. There was an ease to working alongside him that she had not expected, a natural division of labor that required no discussion. He built up the fire without being asked when the evening chill crept in. She pushed a second cup of coffee toward him without looking up from her figures when his own grew cold. And by the time the truth of the numbers became undeniable, somewhere near midnight, they had fallen into the rhythm of 2 people who had worked together far longer than a handful of weeks. Here, Nora said finally, setting one finger against a column. Your July manifest for the upper outposts lists 1,100 pounds of flour delivered. Kane's official filing to the railroad company for that same shipment claims only 600 pounds were sent, the difference marked as spoiled in transit and written off. But you signed for delivery of the full 1,100 pounds at the Peterson cabin yourself. I did, Warren said grimly. I remember hauling it. Nothing spoiled. The Petersons signed for every sack themselves. Then Kane is selling the difference elsewhere. 500 pounds of flour that the railroad company paid for and believes was lost, sold instead for private profit, and the same pattern repeats through every manifest here. Salt pork, coal oil, cornmeal. Month after month, always a small percentage marked spoiled or undelivered, always sold quietly on the side while the families who were meant to receive it go short. And now, with the whole pass declared impassable on a rockslide that does not exist, Warren said slowly, working it through. He means to write off the entire winter shipment as undeliverable and sell every last pound of it before the roads close, leaving Peterson and Callahan and old widow Ruiz with nothing at all come January. While collecting full payment from the railroad company for provisions he never intends to send, Nora sat back, the full ugliness of it settling cold in her stomach. People will starve, Warren. Or freeze when the coal oil never comes and the wood they have is not enough to last a hard winter alone. Not if we stop him first. Warren's voice had gone hard and certain, the voice, Nora imagined, that had once commanded entire wagon trains through storm and river crossing alike. We take this evidence to Marshal Cobb in Deer Creek. He has no love for Kane. The man tried to shortchange the marshal's own brother on a freight contract 2 years back. Kane will not simply allow us to walk to Deer Creek with proof of his fraud, Nora said. He as good as threatened me for asking a single question in his own office. Then we will not tell him we are going, Warren said. We leave at first light before the town wakes. Deer Creek is a hard day's ride, but we can be there and back with the marshal before Kane even notices the manifests are missing from my cabin. It was, Nora thought, a reasonable plan, born of a man who had spent 15 years anticipating trouble on the trail before it arrived. It might even have worked, had Elias Kane not already set his own machinery in motion the moment he saw Nora Doyle walk into his office, asking careful questions about a rockslide that did not exist. They discovered how thoroughly Kane had moved against them the following morning, when they rode out toward the sawmill road that led, eventually, toward Deer Creek, and found the way blocked by a commotion of shouting men and a great plume of dust rising from the timber slope above the mill. The mill at Larkspur Crossing fed logs down a steep gravity spur, a narrow timber track that ran from the high cutting grounds down to the mill pond below. Ore cars converted for the purpose loaded with felled timber and released to run down under their own weight, controlled by brakemen riding the cars with hand brakes and a series of switch points meant to slow their descent. It was dangerous work in good conditions. Nora had heard talk at the trading post of men killed on such tracks further west when a brake failed or a car jumped the rails. This morning, something worse than a simple accident was unfolding. A loaded logging car, 3 tons of felled timber, had broken free at the top of the grade with no brakeman aboard, the hand brake mechanism apparently sabotaged, and was hurtling down the mountain track with gathering speed toward the mill yard below, where a full crew of some 20 men worked stacking cordwood, entirely unaware of the death bearing down on them from above. "Cut brake cable," a man was shouting, running alongside the track uselessly, unable to catch what was already well past any man's speed. "Someone signal the mill, get them clear." "There is no time," Warren said, already wheeling his horse toward the grade, understanding the geometry of the disaster in an instant the way only a man who had spent his life reading terrain and momentum could. "The switch point below the second bend. It feeds either into the mill pond siding or straight through to the yard. If we can throw that switch before the car reaches it, we send it into the pond instead of into those men. How far to the switch? Half a mile, if the horses can hold the grade." He was already moving, and Nora spurred her own horse after him without hesitation, because there was no time to debate who should go and who should stay safe, only time to ride. They came alongside the runaway track at a dead gallop, the roar of the loaded car audible now even over the pounding of hooves, an enormous grinding shriek of iron wheels on iron rails building toward a speed that would turn 3 tons of timber into an unstoppable weapon. Nora could see the mill yard ahead, the men still unaware, still stacking wood, still laughing at some shared joke that would be their last if the car reached them. "There," Warren shouted, pointing to a squat iron lever set beside the tracks where the second bend straightened toward the yard, the switch mechanism that could divert the runaway car onto the siding that ran out over the mill pond instead of straight through the working yard. They reached it perhaps 40 seconds before the car did. Warren was off his horse before it had fully stopped, throwing his whole massive weight against the switch lever, muscles standing out along his forearms and shoulders as the mechanism resisted, rusted from disuse, refusing to yield. "It is jammed," he ground out. "Rust in the pivot." Nora was beside him in an instant, throwing her own weight against the lever alongside his, and still it would not move, the roar of the approaching car swelling now to a deafening pitch, close enough that she could feel the vibration of it through the ground beneath her boots. "The oil," she gasped, remembering suddenly the small tin she always carried for her rifle mechanism, wrenching it from her coat pocket and pouring it hastily along the pivot joint even as Warren kept his shoulder braced against the lever, holding what ground they had gained. Now, together, now. They threw their combined weight against the lever as one, and this time it gave, screaming on its rusted hinge, swinging the switch point over with agonizing slowness that felt, in that stretched and terrible moment, slower than any motion Nora had ever witnessed, until finally, with a final grinding shudder, the rails aligned toward the pond siding rather than the yard. The runaway car struck the switch 3 seconds later, its iron wheels catching the new alignment and screaming off toward the pond instead of the yard, and the men working below looked up in bewildered alarm, just in time to see 3 tons of timber and iron plow off the end of the siding and crash thunderously into the mill pond in an explosion of water and splintered wood, rather than into their own unprotected bodies. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the mill yard erupted into shouting, men running toward the pond, others simply standing and staring at the space where they had been working not 30 seconds before, understanding with visible, shaking relief exactly how close they had come to dying. Nora found herself sitting hard in the dirt beside the switch lever, her hands still shaking, and Warren was there instantly, kneeling in front of her, his enormous hands framing her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible in a man who had just wrestled a rusted iron mechanism into submission through sheer strength. "You are hurt," he said, though she was not, and she realized he was simply checking, the same thorough assessment he had given her the night of the bridge, the night of the fog, a man who had made her safety, without either of them quite naming it, into something he needed to verify with his own eyes. "I am well," she managed. "Only frightened. That was closer than I would ever wish to come again." "That break was cut," Warren said grimly, some of the softness in his face hardening back into purpose as he helped her to her feet, and they walked together toward the wreckage at the pond's edge, where the mill foreman was already crouched examining the mangled brake mechanism that had been recovered from the wreck. No accident wears through a hand brake clean like that. Someone sabotaged this car deliberately. The foreman, a grizzled man named Otis Beale who had run the Larkspur mill for a decade, looked up with a face gone gray with understanding. "You are right, Hunter. This was cut with a blade, not worn through by use. Someone meant for this car to run wild." "Kane," Nora said quietly, and Warren nodded, the same grim certainty in his eyes. "He could not stop us reaching Deer Creek by threats alone, not with the marshal's own history against him," Warren said. "So he tried a different kind of message. 20 dead millworkers would have thrown this whole valley into such chaos and grief that nobody would have spared a thought for provisioning manifests for weeks, maybe months, long enough for him to finish selling off the winter stores and cover every trace. He was willing to kill 20 men to protect his scheme," Nora said, sick with the understanding of it. "Warren, if he is willing to go this far, what will he do when he learns we survived and mean to ride to Deer Creek regardless?" "Then we do not give him the chance to learn it," Warren said, already moving toward the horses. "We ride now hard, and we do not stop until we reach the marshal's office." They rode through the remainder of that day and long into the night, taking a longer route around Larkspur, crossing itself to avoid the road that passed near Kane's office, pushing the horses as hard as either dared without ruining them on the mountain trails. Nora had ridden hard before in her life, chasing weather ahead of a storm, but never with quite this weight of urgency behind her, never with the knowledge that an entire valley's worth of families hung on whether she and the man riding beside her reached help before their enemy reached them first. They stopped only once near midnight to rest the horses at a shallow creek crossing, and it was there, in the brief quiet with the animals drinking, and the stars finally clear and brilliant overhead after days of autumn haze, that Warren spoke the words Nora would remember for the rest of her life. "I have guided 100 families across 2,000 miles of wilderness," he said, low, watching the water rather than her face. And I have never once in 15 years felt the fear I felt today, watching that car bear down and not knowing if we would clear that switch in time with you standing beside me. I was afraid too, Nora admitted. That is not what I mean. He turned to her then, and in the starlight his face held none of the guarded wariness she had first seen in it, only something raw and honest that made her breath catch. I have spent 15 years responsible for other people's safety, and never once let myself want anything for my own sake beyond a quiet place to finally set down the reins. And then a bridge gave way beneath a woman I had known 4 minutes, and I found I wanted, for the first time in longer than I can remember, something more than quiet. I wanted her safe. I wanted her close. I have wanted it every day since, more each time I see you, until I hardly know myself for wanting it so plainly. Nora felt something crack open in her chest, warm and terrifying and entirely welcome. Warren Hunter, she said softly. I got lost on my own trapline in a fog thick enough to swallow the moon, and the man who found me rode 2 hours through it without a single complaint, because he could not bear the thought of me facing the dark alone. I have thought of little else since. I believe I have wanted the same thing you describe, only I did not have the words for it until just now, hearing you say them first. He closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step back. And when she did not, when instead she rose up to meet him, his kiss was gentle in a way that seemed to cost him considerable effort. A man of enormous strength holding every ounce of it in careful reserve for the sake of something he had decided, in that moment, mattered more than his own need. They reached Deer Creek 2 hours after dawn, exhausted, saddle-sore, and utterly resolved, and found Marshal Cobb, a lean, weathered man with a reputation for hard fairness, willing to listen the moment Nora laid out the manifests and her own survey figures side by side across his desk. I have had my eye on Elias Kane a good while, Cobb admitted, studying the discrepancies with a deepening frown. Never had proof solid enough to move on. This, he tapped the stacked manifests, this is proof enough to hang a fraud charge on, and if what you tell me about the mill car is true, attempted murder besides. I will ride back with you myself, and I am bringing 2 deputies. The ride back to Larkspur Crossing felt shorter than the ride out, buoyed as they were by the marshal's grim, steady presence, and the knowledge that justice, so long as they could reach the valley before Kane finished covering his tracks, was finally within reach. They arrived at Larkspur Crossing on a bright, cold autumn afternoon, the trading post crowded with the usual harvest traffic. Wagons and cattle and townsfolk gathered for the weekly market day. And it was into this crowd that Marshal Cobb rode directly toward Kane's office, Nora and Warren close behind, the manifests clutched safe in the survey case. Kane came out onto his office porch at the sound of horses, his easy salesman's smile already forming, and it died on his face the instant he saw the marshal's badge and the grim set of Nora Doyle's jaw beside Warren Hunter's considerable, immovable presence. "Marshal Cobb," Kane said, recovering some composure, "what brings you all this way?" "Fraud against the railroad provisioning contract," Cobb said flatly, dismounting with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "An attempted murder of 20 millworkers by way of a sabotaged brake cable. I have got sworn manifests, survey records, and a mill foreman's testimony that says the cut on that brake was made with a blade, not worn through by use. You are going to want a lawyer, Kane, and a good one." The gathered crowd, drawn by the commotion, pressed closer, and Nora saw understanding move through them in waves as Cobb laid out the scheme in plain, damning language for all to hear. The falsified rock slide, the flour and salt pork and coal oil sold quietly on the side while families who had already paid for it through railroad taxes went without. The sabotaged runaway car meant to bury the whole matter beneath a tragedy too enormous to question. "You would have let my grandchildren freeze," came a voice from the crowd, an old woman's voice, cracked with fury, and Nora recognized Widow Ruiz, come down from the pass for market day, her face white with a rage that made her look, for a moment, decades younger. "For money. You would have let my babies freeze in the snow for money." Kane's composure finally broke entirely, and in the ugly scramble that followed, an attempt to bolt for his horse that two of Cobb's deputies put down swiftly and without excessive violence, the crowd's mood turned from shock to something harder, older, the particular fury of mountain people who understood in their bones exactly how close they had all come to a winter of starvation and death dressed up as bad luck and rockslides. "There will be a full accounting," Cobb promised the gathered crowd, once Kane was secured and the immediate chaos settled. "Every family owed provisions under that contract will receive them before the pass closes, out of Kane's own seized assets if the railroad company drags its feet, which I do not believe it will, once it understands the scale of what has been stolen from it as well. I give you my word on that." It took the better part of 2 weeks to see the promise made good, 2 weeks in which Nora found herself working alongside Warren nearly every day, organizing the recovered provisions, riding with the replacement wagons up the very switchback that Kane had falsely declared impassable, watching the relief on the faces of the Petersons and the Callahans and Widow Ruiz as flour sacks and coal oil tins and salt pork barrels finally arrived, weeks ahead of the first real snow. It was work that suited them both. Nora had come to realize this business of practical partnership, of riding together and planning together and solving problems side by side, rather than one of them simply rescuing the other. She had watched Warren Hunter's reputation shift through those 2 weeks as well, the whispered stories of an abandoning wagon master giving way, slowly but unmistakably, to a truer accounting. The man who had ridden into fog to find a lost trapper's daughter, who had thrown himself against a rusted switch lever to save 20 millworkers, who had ridden through a full day and night without rest to bring proof of a deadly fraud before a marshal in time to save an entire valley's winter. "They look at you differently now," she observed one evening, the two of them sharing a simple supper at his cabin table, the fire burning low and warm against the first real chill of the season creeping down from the peaks. "They look at us differently," Warren corrected, passing her the bread without being asked, the same easy domestic rhythm that had grown between them over weeks of shared work, shared meals, shared purpose. "Whitfield told me yesterday half the valley credits you with saving them from starvation, and the other half credits the both of us together, which I find I do not mind at all, being spoken of in the same breath as you." "I find I do not mind it either," Nora said, and meant it entirely, thinking of how different this felt from the cautious, solitary life she had built for herself after her mother's death years before, checking traps alone, keeping her own counsel, trusting little beyond her father's steady presence. Warren Hunter had not diminished that independence in the slightest, she realized. He had simply given it somewhere warm to rest some evenings, without asking her to set it down entirely. "Your father tells me the trapline is nearly done for the season," Warren said, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup, with an expression that suggested he was working his way toward something. "Another 2 weeks, perhaps, before the deep snow makes the higher sets impractical." She studied him, curious at the careful way he had introduced the subject. "Why do you ask?" "Because I have been thinking," he said, and set the cup down with a deliberateness that told her whatever came next had been considered a good while. That a woman who can read a mountain better than most surveyors, who kept her head lost in a fog thick enough to swallow the moon, who threw her whole weight against a rusted switch lever without a moment's hesitation when 20 men's lives hung on it, ought not spend the rest of her winters running that trapline circling in the dark, wondering if some fool mountain man is going to come find her again. "Are you suggesting I am accident-prone, Warren Hunter?" "I am suggesting," he said, and here, at last, the ghost of that rare smile came fully into being, warm and unguarded, "that I would consider it the greatest honor of my considerable and occasionally foolish life if you would agree to stop circling that trapline alone, and instead let me build you a proper cabin close enough to mine that if you ever get turned around in the fog again, you need only holler and I will hear you before you've gone 20 paces. That is a very roundabout way of proposing marriage, Mr. Hunter. I have spent 15 years choosing my words carefully so as not to spook a wagon train into panic on a bad trail, he said, laughing now, a full, unguarded sound she had heard perhaps twice before and treasured each time. I find I have not entirely lost the habit, even for something this important. Let me try it plainer then, if you will permit me. He came around the table, knelt beside her chair with a gravity that made her breath catch despite the humor still lingering in his eyes, and took her hand in both of his, enormous and rough and steady as bedrock. Nora Doyle. I have guided 100 families safely across 2,000 miles of wilderness, and not one of those journeys taught me half what I have learned in these past weeks beside you, about courage, about judgment, about what it means to trust another person with the whole of yourself, rather than only the parts you can afford to lose. I would be grateful, more grateful than I know how to properly say, if you would marry me, and let me spend whatever years I have left making certain you never have to find your own way home in the dark alone again. Nora looked down at him, this enormous, gentle, formidable man who had caught her from a falling bridge and found her lost in fog and thrown his whole strength against a rusted lever to save 20 strangers, and felt her heart settle into something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely certain. On one condition, she said, and watched a flicker of genuine alarm cross his face before she continued, unable to keep the smile from her own voice. You must promise that if I ever do get turned around on that trapline again, you will not let me live it down for less than a full year of teasing. It seems only fair, given how thoroughly I intend to remind you, every time you misjudge a fog bank, that I once found the switch oil while you stood there wrestling a rusted lever like it had personally insulted you. Warren laughed again, that rare, full sound, and rose to pull her up into his arms, careful as always of his own strength even in the fullness of his joy. I promise nothing less than a full year, he said against her hair, and gladly, so long as you promise in return to spend the rest of your winters circling toward my door instead of away from it. That, Nora said, tilting her face up to his, is a promise I believe I can keep. They were married before the first heavy snow closed Kestrel Pass for the season, a small ceremony at Larkspur Crossing with Silas Doyle beaming despite his bad leg, and Ezra Whitfield standing witness, and half the valley turning out with pies and fiddle music to celebrate not only a wedding, but the safe passage of an entire community's winter, secured at last through the courage of a trapper's daughter who trusted her own judgment over rumor, and a mountain man whose strength, once given fully to someone worth the giving, proved gentler and more enduring than any story told against him had ever allowed. Elias Kane stood trial that winter in Deer Creek and was sentenced to a long term in the territorial prison, his seized assets funding provisions for 3 winters running, and Warren Hunter's name, once spoken with wariness in every trading post between the Missouri and the Bitterroot, came instead to be spoken the way it was meant to be spoken all along, as the name of a man who had found a woman lost in the dark and never once let go of her hand again.